It's worthy to take an overview, a generalized overview of the reproductive system itself. Now, we're going to be covering the reproductive system in the next lab, but for now, I want to simply point out that this entire structure we're looking at here is going to be the uterus, at least one arm of the uterus here. This would be the uterine tube or the fallopian tube, and this would be the body of the uterus. This here is the ovary, one of the ovaries. There's one on either side. And the ovary, as the name suggests, the ovary has the job of producing an ovum. Some students come into this course with a misunderstanding that the uterus and the ovaries are actually one structure. That is actually not true. They are separate organs. So this is an ovary. It produces an ovum, and here it is, a little haploid ovum, a haploid egg that is produced in the process of ovulation. Here it is, ovulation. Now, after ovulation, the ovum only has about 24 hours to survive unless it is fertilized. And that's what we're actually looking at in this picture here. So what we're looking at here is a fertilization event where the haploid sperm and the haploid egg, or the haploid ovum, come together to produce a zygote. So letter A here is a zygote. It is one large fertilized cell, and it's surrounded by a structure called the zona pellucida. The zona pellucida will be present in these stages, then it begins to degrade by this stage here. Now, what's going to happen next is called cleavage. Cleavage is the mitotic events that lead to the separation, or the mitosis, the mitotic events that lead to many smaller cells being developed. So one large cell into 4 into 32. Once you have 32, it's kind of a solid mass of 32 cells. This has a specific name called the morula, and it will be a morula after about 3 days. So again, the ovulation occurs. It is generally thought that fertilization happens very quickly after fertilization because the ovum only lives for about 24 hours post-ovulation. So once the ovum is fertilized, it makes its way through the uterus into the body, and then it implants. Wherever it is at about day 7, that is where it is going to implant. So here in this case, it's implanting properly in the wall of the uterus. This outer wall of the uterus is called the endometrium. And you notice the term endo there means inner, so there could be the misunderstanding, of course, that this is the innermost wall of the uterus, but of course you know by now this is actually the outermost wall of the uterus because it is closest to the outside of the body. And we'll be discussing the other structures of the uterus when we talk about the reproductive system. All right. In this picture, we also have, so we have the morula at day 3, we have the implantation at day 7. Implantation will last from about day 7 for about 5 days after that. So from day 7 through day 12, it will be completely buried inside the wall of that endometrium. And at this point, it's going to be called a blastocyst or a blastula. What that means is that the morula has begun to actually hollow out. So we'll start to see a cavity inside of here called a blastocyst cavity, and then we'll see 2 distinct layers of cells, 2 distinct types of cells, I should say. There's an outer layer of basically one single layer of cells that is called a trophoblast, which serves as protection and basically takes over the role of the zona pellucida. And then we have the embryoblast, which is it's a cell mass. All right, so this takes us up through day 7 through 12. And then we start into the next phase, which is the gastrula stage. And in the gastrula stage, we're going to have gastrulation, which is where we have primary germ layers beginning to develop into structures that will eventually become the 3 main layers of the body. So in this picture, those 3 main cell layers are seen here. The 3 germ layers are considered the ectoderm up here in blue, the mesoderm in the middle, sort of in orange, and then kind of this golden layer underneath, which is called the endoderm. ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. And take a look on the bottom of page 658. It's kind of interesting to note what these things will eventually develop into. Kind of notably, the ectoderm becomes the epidermis of the skin and the nervous system. It's strange to think of it, but actually epithelial cells and nervous cells are close cousins of each other. They derive from the same primordial germ layer. Anyway, I've always thought that was interesting. I don't know how you feel about it, but I think it's pretty cool. Okay, the mesoderm is going to be a number of different structures. The muscles, for example, the dermis, the bones of the body, the cartilage, kidneys, the ureters. And then the endoderm is going to become the gastrointestinal tract, the urinary tract, the reproductive tract, the liver, gallbladder, pancreas. Again, take a look on the bottom of page 658 for a nice defined list of all of these different structures. I know there's quite a lot to look at in this picture. There's just a few more things that I want to point out to you, though. What we're looking at in letter A is an implanting. This is like a structure that is still implanting, a blastocyst that is still implanting. This is at 7.5 days, so it's basically just been implanted. Now this is a 12-day blastocyst, so this is fully implanted. Remember, it implants between days 7 and 12. And then this here is a 16-day embryo. Oh, I want to point out the chorion. So in this structure here, this is the chorion becoming formed. The chorion actually takes over the role of the trophoblast. Remember, the trophoblast in this picture, the trophoblast was that single outer layer of cells that had some protection. This will become the chorion, and it is also shown here, this little circle here is the chorion. And so here it's developing, and here it is fully formed, the chorion. An extension of the chorion, of course, would be a villi. The term villus means finger. So a chorionic villus means fingers that are kind of protruding from the chorion. So a structure of the chorion, but it's sort of invaginating. And that is going to become, and that's actually shown in this picture as well. The chorionic villi are shown here. Here, 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 chorionic villi. And what we're looking at in this picture is actually a 4.5-week embryo. In this picture, we start to see two other structures, the decidua basalis and the decidua capsularis. Now, the decidua basalis, I know that these sound like complicated words, but it's actually not too bad. The term basalis means basal, and capsularis means a capsule. So the decidua basalis is at the basal layer of this structure. It's actually part of the uterus. It's part of that endometrium layer of the uterus, and so is the decidua capsularis. So the decidua basalis, let me look up the term here. The decidua basalis is the portion of the endometrium that lies beneath the embryoblast and eventually lies beneath the embryo. The decidua capsularis is the portion of the endometrium that is on the luminal face, facing the lumen of the uterus. So they're both parts of the uterus, of the endometrium. And the reason I bring this up is because when you see the decidua basalis and the chorionic villi, these together are going to become the placenta. Now, the placenta is the structure that allows for the bringing together of nutrients and oxygen to the developing fetus, and then also the removal of waste. So these structures are going to start to become this new organ. The only new organ that is ever formed in a human after development ends is the placenta. And of course, it's a temporary organ that only lasts during a pregnancy and then is delivered after the baby is delivered. So the baby is delivered and the placenta is delivered next. In this picture, we can also see the chorion here. Oh, and this, we should look at the amnion as well. So the amnion is seen as early as here. This is eventually going to become the amniotic sac. But the amniotic sac encloses all the fluids and encloses the entire structure. So we actually start to see the amnion developing here, and it is also shown in this picture here. Here's our amnion, and here's our amniotic cavity. And again, in our 4.5-week embryo, we of course see the amnion here, and the amniotic fluid inside of there, the amniotic cavity inside of there. And then this is a representation of a 13-week fetus. And we can still see some of the familiar structures. We see the decidua basalis here. We see the decidua capsularis here. Still part of that endometrium, but it's, again, underlying and overlying. And this is a closer up view of the same. We're still seeing the amnion here. Now this structure is going to be the umbilical cord. In this structure we can also see the chorionic villus here. And these contain, at this point, they contain obvious capillaries. These would be considered fetal capillaries. The gastrula stage lasts about 6 weeks, that gastrulation where you start to develop those 3 germ layers, the endoderm, mesoderm, and ectoderm. That lasts about 6 weeks. So although there are different cell stages here, such as zygote, blastocyst, gastrulation, the term embryo applies basically from the level of fertilization all the way up through week 9, past fertilization. At week 9, post-fertilization, this would now be considered a fetus up until the time of birth.